All right, so let me introduce. It has been exactly 1 year since we have had Dr. Eller here with us. Dr. Eller is a history professor at Catawba Valley Community College in Hickory. He is also the executive director of their publications house, which is called Red Hawk Publications. Now, besides his book and documentary on Piedmont Airlines, and why he was here with us last April was he published a book called Well Crafted, The History of Furniture Manufacturing in Western North Carolina. And that was an excellent program if you missed it, but the book is really excellent. And for us here in High Point, anything about the furniture industry, we like. We love to have that. He's also done some books on history of Hickory, which is where Catawba Valley Community College is, in case you didn't know, and on the 1944 polio epidemic there. So let me not take any more time. Dr. Richard Eller telling us about Piedmont Airlines.
Thank you. I want to do this a little backwards because I got a feeling. In working on this book, which is quite a few years now, I got to interview so many wonderful people concerning Piedmont Airlines. And I got a feeling you guys have some stories connected with Piedmont. How many of you flew on a Piedmont plane? How many of you were employed by Piedmont? I got several. So, I'm a collector of stories. Tell me, what do you remember? What's your favorite memory of Piedmont Airlines?
The smokehouse almonds.
Say it again?
The smokehouse almonds.
No.
The almonds, yeah.
Oh, the smokehouse almonds, yeah. That you got on the plane, yeah. Any other experiences? Yes, sir. Tell me the one you were telling me about.
Yeah, the 1967, that's one of my first job interviews, and I was excited to fly on Piedmont Airlines. I heard they had such attractive stewardesses. And so I started getting on the plane, going to stairs, and I looked up, and there was a steward. That was a guy. I never found that day out.
They were nice people.
They were nice people. What do you mean by that? Can you expand on that?
Very accommodating, very friendly, very warm.
I had at one time they called them stewardesses. Talked to a stewardess, and she said after the merger, she flew a few years for USAir, and said she was attending a person who was flying, and he looked up at her and said, "You were Piedmont, weren't you?" And she says, "How can you tell?" And it's for that very reason, that they were just nicer, they were more accommodating, more helpful, more plugged into what they were doing. And I'm not going to throw any stones at USAir, although people do. I heard more than once people refer to it as useless air. So there were all these things about Piedmont that made it just a magical, in my opinion, airline. Now, granted, I didn't talk to everybody who worked for Piedmont, so I'm sure I missed a couple of these, but there was no one who worked for Piedmont Airlines that wouldn't do it again. As a matter of fact, they all said when Mr. Davis, when the airline ended, if Mr. Davis had wanted to go and start a new airline, they were with him. They would have quit USAir that day and went with him. Where do you get that? How does that happen? I've only encountered one other company that was similar to that, and it was a furniture company up in Hickory called Southern Desk Company. And it was the same exact environment in terms of the way people worked. They would not miss a day. I can't think of his last name, but he was a mechanic for Piedmont. And he said he would go in sick. Now, we don't advise against that, or advise that these days. But he said he would go in sick because he feared missing out on something. He wanted to be there every day and be part of it. Where do you how do you create that kind of culture? And that for me was one of the great things to find out, because as a kid, I grew up in Winston-Salem, and we'd go past Smith Reynolds Airport, and I was always hoping that we could stop so we could see one of those, one of those planes in that era, Martin 404 or something, come across so that you could, see what these majestic things look like. And it was just it was a tremendous time. And so when the opportunity came to do this book, and the Pilots Association kind of hit me up and said, you've done a couple other things, would you be interested in that? And they had no idea that I grew up in Winston. I said, boy, would I. And so I just got tape recorder and started interviewing people, asking them what it was like, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and there was so much more good than there was bad or ugly. Now, there's a couple of things, but it was an airline unlike any other, and certainly unlike anything that you have the choice to fly on these days. You said you worked for Piedmont?
I did.
Can you tell us about it? I mean, when and where?
Hired in '85, so not as much time there. I had about 5 years before the merger, but it's absolutely everything that as you portrayed it, from the hiring process. I've gone through several interviews at this point, and Piedmont was certainly one of my objectives there. And when the final part of the interview process, you're sitting down with a couple of pilots, they're asking you things. And it was more like going to a family reunion to two guys I'd never met. It was just, we were sharing kids' stories and everything else by the end, and it just always had that sort of family feel.
Isn't that crazy? That instant camaraderie. How would you like to go to work for a company like that? Sir, you said you worked for Piedmont?
Yes.
Can you tell us about it?
Well, I was just thinking, all the good stories and everything I know, I can't say here.
A pilot told me the same thing, although I got a few. But what he said is you do the Margaret Mitchell thing. After you write this book, a few years later, you write a fictionalized story of an airline, and you include all those stories that you can't tell, because that would make for, the way he put it at the time of the book, nobody would believe, but the heck of it was, it's true, How long where'd you work for Piedmont? How long and when?
Well, I began in Atlanta, Georgia, then Knoxville, Tennessee, then Virginia Beach, Virginia, Norfolk, and then back to Roanoke, Virginia, then down to Winston-Salem.
Okay. Work for the station or on the line?
That was a pilot base.
Okay, yeah. All right. Anybody else? Good story about flying on, or bad? We'll take bad. Yes, sir.
Well, this is kind of secondhand. Once knew a guy who was a member of not the pilots union, but I think the machinists, and talked about how, the Piedmont days, the labor and management, both give a little, take a little, and it was more contentious later, the USAir days. But the example he gave is, he said once one of his colleagues needed to use the cherry picker at his home for something or another, and Piedmont let him do it. And later, I said, he couldn't even think of anything like something like that.
Yeah, can you imagine that happening these days?
Yeah.
I saw a hand over here. Yes, sir.
Yeah, in the 80s, I was on Piedmont all the time, all over the country. And there were 2 flights a day to Los Angeles. And I was coming back from there one time, and the woman behind me in line was really worried about flying on this airline nobody had ever heard of. And was it going to be all right? I told her, well, they're all much the same when things are going well. But if things are falling apart because of weather delays or something like that, you want to be on Piedmont because they handle that better than anyone else.
Good point. Yes. Yeah, because in some, especially during the 60s and moving into the 70s, they were pee-poo or the puddle jumper. There was all sorts of names that they gave Piedmont because nobody really took them seriously. They weren't a trunk line. They weren't Eastern. But then what happened to Eastern? And Piedmont was there afterwards. If you go back to the beginning of this, let's start, because I love the origin stories about where these things, what happens with these things and where they go. And I would argue that Winston-Salem was the perfect environment for an airline. Simply, well, it had several factors, of which 4 of the 5 I put up here. Number one, Winston-Salem was an early adopter because there were a lot of things going on in Winston-Salem. I mean, think about the number of large companies that at least at one time were based in Winston-Salem. You had Haynes, you had R.J. Reynolds. Later on, you're going to have Krispy Kreme. You have Piedmont. You have all, Texas Pete, T.W. Garner. All of these companies create that environment. Now, it wasn't on their own, but in 1911, what is that, 8 years after the Wright brothers, 7 and change, they had their own air show. So there was this interest in aviation because it was new and happening. The second one is going to be and I had a couple people tell me that had remembered this or had heard about it, kind of you're talking about secondhand, the day Charles Lindbergh flew into Winston-Salem. Remember, in 1927, he's the first one to go across the Atlantic successfully. And when he came back, they put him on a tour to talk about air safety, how air travel is the future of transportation in the United States. He was supposed to land in one city in every state in the Union, in 1927. And he landed in Greensboro, but because of the influence of Winston-Salem, he made a second stop. And several of those guys talked about how inspired it was, or how inspiring it was to have Charles Lindbergh there and talking about that, as though he's the one that turned them on to a life of aviation. And when he left the grandstand, Charles Lindbergh was never known for being a great speaker. It probably wasn't a rousing speech, other than the fact of it's Lindbergh. They tore the bleachers apart just to have a splinter, so that they had a remnant of being where Charles Lindbergh done stood. Now, all of that probably
They called off school that day, so all the schools.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Had it at Haynes Park.
Yes, because Lindbergh was, this was the new cutting edge of technology at the time. Now, it probably wouldn't have happened had it not been for the Reynolds family. Because in 1919, I think it's Roscoe Turner that lands on the lawn out at Renola. And Dick Reynolds was interested in aviation. It's well documented that Smith Reynolds, the younger brother, was enthralled by aviation to the point of flying from Europe to Asia, as he did. And when Dick started an airline in New York, I think that really solidified the fact that he was himself plugged into it. Now, there was a crash, and so Reynolds Airways pretty much folded and came back. But one of the people he brought back with him is this guy, Mac McGinnis, who supposedly was there on the day that they rolled the Spirit of St. Louis out in order to take off in the crossing of the Atlantic. He came back. He was the personal pilot to Dick Reynolds. And he is really that catalyst that helps start Camel City Flying Service. Those are 4 of them. The 5th one is Tom Davis. This could not have happened had you not had Mr. Davis. And without fail, other than Zeke Saunders, without fail, everybody that I talked to when I interviewed him referred to him respectfully as Mr. Davis, because he was that much a towering figure over the whole thing. He created that culture. He had this incredible ability. I talked to a couple of people and they couldn't define just how it happened, but if you worked for Piedmont and he saw you, he knew you by name. Now, some people said he's leaning over to Zeke, who is that? I don't know if that's true or not, or he just had one of those kind of memories. But it could be years between times that he saw you. And if you worked for him, he would come up and he made it his business to know you. That's how well connected he was to his worker base. That's why I think that the culture that we were talking about, loving and working for him, that's why it happened. Now, he himself has ties to the Reynolds, because his father was a salesman for R.J. Reynolds. And so he grows up in that climate. His house today, or the house he grew up in, is out there on...
Polo and Renola.
Is where?
Polo and Renola.
Polo, yeah. It's still a real estate company.
No, it's owned by Wake Forest. It's
Oh.
family gave it to Wake Forest.
Okay, once upon a time, it was a real estate company. And the interesting thing about Tom Davis is, as a young man, he had asthma. And so once he got inspired to engage in flight lessons, which he convinced his father to let him, take. He was actually taking flight lessons before his father knew about it. He found out that he breathed better up in the air. And so he went to college in Arizona, went out there, and then came back and got a job as a salesman for Camel City Flying Service with Mac McGinnis. Now, the interesting thing about Mac was he was an intrepid guy. He is certainly one of those fly by the seat of your pants aviators. But he wasn't necessarily as good with the organizational side of the business. Tom was. And so it worked out that Tom went from salesperson to part of the management structure, eventually, all of it, with Camel City Flying Service. And the other thing that was rather fortunate, not for the nation, but for Tom Davis, was World War II came along. He found a way in which he could use the facilities out at Miller Airport, which is what it was before Smith Reynolds, and give people who were interested in becoming pilots in the war their first flight hours. And that was the civilian pilot training program that he fostered. So Tom Davis is an incredible force, really the thing that made it happen. And they're training pilots all through World War II so that they could get enough hours that they could go in the Army Air Corps. And all through 42, 43, and right at the beginning of 44, when the government suspended the program, this was the way in which he was able to engage in a flight business. Now, supposedly, he said when in January 44, the government suspended the program, they could see the light at the end of the tunnel to win the war, that he felt he had to do something to keep these people employed. And that's when he began the idea of commercial flight, to create an airline that could get a government contract and begin flying. He also had Piedmont Aviation, which was a company out at the airport. Remember, they, I think it's 42, it's when Dick Reynolds is mayor of Winston-Salem, is when they renamed it Smith Reynolds, have stations out at the airport. And his right-hand man, who I've mentioned before, his executive vice president, who carried with him a long way and who outlived him, I had the privilege to be able to talk to him numerous times, was Zeke Saunders. As a matter of fact, Mr. Davis named him. His real name is Harold Kimball Saunders, but Mr. Davis kept saying Zeke, which was a reference from, I think, Sergeant York, an old movie, because Zeke came from Catawba County. So what he's doing when he gets these routes for the CAB, not the FAA in those days, was to create what they called an air bridge. And that was, you flew from the Piedmont and the lowlands of North Carolina and Virginia across the Appalachians to get you to either Cincinnati or Lexington or Louisville. Now these are the days of the DC-3s. And so these are not pressurized. They're just, they're getting over the mountains, but they're not flying way high. And so some of those pilots are going to come back. They had 12 that started, come back and fly for Piedmont Airlines. And that air bridge was successful, as one person that's in the documentary talks about, that it's the fact that you could get where you want to go, but it's going to take you all day to get there, because you would stop here, and before you got to your destination. But it's the early days of air travel. It is, the first flight was in February of 48. It is new, it is novel, and it is successful, even though you're really only talking about, unless you remove the coffin from the back of a DC-3, you're only talking about 21 passengers. Generally all male, mostly very much male, because it was a way to conduct business, to get from one place to the other. Now, one of the reasons I want to know what year it was, when you were talking about wanting to see a stewardess, is because Piedmont's one of the last to add stewardesses. Any idea why? because Mr. Davis was extremely frugal. And he knew that if he had female flight attendants, there were two things wrong with that picture. One was they couldn't lift the mailbags. You know, their labor was not going to be what they needed for their turnarounds, and they prided themselves on their turnarounds. They like to clock themselves to see if they could get a 4-minute turnaround. Land people off the plane, get the mail off, get the baggage off, get everything they need on, get the passengers on, and fly out. That was a sign that to themselves that they were doing a good job. The other thing was, if it was a female flight attendant, you had to pay for another room for layovers, so that two pilots and the steward could all bunk in the same room. And so they said Mr. Davis counted paper clips. He was extremely frugal with one exception, and that was safety. Because where he could make sure that his airline was the safest airline out there, he would spend the money for that. The other things, they could wait. So this is a picture of the first 5 flight attendants that came in 1962, not too many years before you flew, when they finally followed the industry trend. And some people said, I knew we were a big airline then when we got female flight attendants, because they were, they considered themselves in the big leagues because they had female flight attendants. You had stations that sometimes were very much hand-built. There's a story of, now you never see this happen, there's a story of at least one, probably more, of a person who would call the ticket booth and say, I'm running late, can you hold the plane? And they would hold the plane. Because they're looking to satisfy every customer they possibly can and be that airline. You know, if in going from Winston to Greensboro, I think somebody told me they were in the air like 17 minutes. I mean, it just wasn't up and down. But this is the way Piedmont's making its reputation as we go through the 50s and 60s. And you can see a kind of a progression on the part of the airline as they very methodically, maybe not all the time having the right answer, but methodically thought about the aircraft that they're using, starting with the DC-3. Then they go to the F-27. And as I was saying earlier, it's not always compliments, because a friend of mine's father worked in the furniture industry in Hickory, and he would fly using Piedmont, and he referred to the F-27 as the vomit comet because of the kind of instability that he felt when he was flying. But they flew that one, which didn't work out as well as they might have liked. Then they went to the Fairchild-Hiller 227, which was similar to this, but really where they made a right decision was buying used Martin 404s. That became pretty much in the 60s the workhorse. And the airline is expanding in those days. They also made the decision to buy a Japanese plane, the YS-11, and took a lot of flack for it, because we're only 20 years after the Second World War. There was still kind of a distrust of the Japanese. The thing they found, though, that when the YS-11 was designed, it was designed for a Japanese customer who was, generally speaking, shorter than an American. And so when Americans sit down in those seats, it was like sitting in a child's chair. I mean, it was just farther to the ground. The window on the side was way up here, and so they had to have that retrofitted. Those were the pre-jet days. Then they get a couple of 727s, but the workhorse for Piedmont throughout the 70s and 80s is really going to be the 737. At one point, they bought more of them from Boeing than any other airline, because they're smaller, and Piedmont had a fair amount of stops, as you saw with that earlier map. And so these were easier to get up and get down. Now, in the early days, like the DC-3s, they're flying, not very high. Some people would say, told stories about how they would fly over the same houses. You know, it was kind of a regular route that they flew. And that when some guys flew over their parents' house, they would drop things out for the parents to find. I can't verify that. I don't know if that's true, but it's a fun story. You know, it's one of those they tell. There were crashes, and there was loss of life, but I will say that the airline, comparatively speaking, for the number of miles it flew and all the places it flew, it was a tremendously, like you were talking about, a tremendously safe airline. The first one happened in Virginia in 1959. And in talking to Ronnie Macklin, he was head of maintenance or in the maintenance hierarchy there. He said he always had to prove it every time he went out on one of these that it wasn't a malfunction of the engine. And that one, they believe that the pilot kind of got off of his signals. You know, he got disoriented, didn't know where he was at, and hit the side of Buck's Elbow Mountain. That fuselage, or what's left of it, is still up there on that mountain. It took them days before they could find the crash. And eventually, the crash happened on a Friday night, and on Sunday morning is when they discovered it. They had looked for 36 hours before they were able to find it. And there was one survivor from that flight. Then he had one in Hickory. I just wrote about it for our local newspaper just a couple months ago. And that was a flight coming in, and there was a Cessna that was flying kind of in the same direction and runs up and hits the Piedmont plane. Now, that Cessna, which had 4 executives from the furniture industry, because it was April during the market, once that plane hits, it falls to the ground. No survivors there. But the pilot of the Piedmont plane was able to bring that flight in for a safe landing. And if you look at the pictures of it, it shows kind of the skid marks of the other plane, which is interesting in that it was remarkably similar to what happened in Asheville, Hendersonville, in 1967. And this gives you kind of a drawing of that. It was another Cessna, another private plane that is in a place where it should not be. And then this one's taking off. And unfortunately, when it hits, they both drop out of the sky. That was the largest loss of life. That was a 727. It's a jet that they were flying, one of just several they had. In between was a crash in Newbern that was a pilot, co-pilot, and stewardess that were ferrying a plane for use the next day. And it gets too low to the ground, they hit the treetops, and it just takes it out. And the final one is 1968 in Charleston, when, if you know anything about the Charleston airport or the town of Charleston, they had kind of carved off the top of a mountain, and the glide path wasn't working. And when the plane comes in, it was only about 10, 12 feet below where it could have hit the landing. And since they didn't have the glide path to kind of direct them, they were working off visual flight. And it hits, just under where the runway was. Those are sad days. And everyone took every single time there was a mishap very, very hard. Especially the one in Asheville, because they were so proud. They had held off for years of getting a jet, and when they do, that was one of only a couple they had. They never did really have too many 727s. So that hit the company very hard, because people took this personally. It was part of that culture was, it's a sign of pride. It is a show of what we as a collective group can do. Because in the days when Mr. Davis, it took them 4 years to get the allowance to be able to fly as a commercial airline. And there were other airlines competing with them. And they kind of always felt that David and Goliath thing. That you had the trunk carriers, United, American, Eastern, that were flying the major routes. These airlines, these smaller airlines like State and Piedmont, were flying people to get them to those destinations. But throughout the 60s, you can see how it's expanding, how the network here is getting larger as they're flying into, for the first time in the 60s, Atlanta, or DC, or they're going further beyond Cincinnati, they're going to Columbus, all the way to Nashville. And there's a certain pride that comes along with those planes because Mr. Davis or Mrs. Davis, one or the other, named every single plane they had. You know, you had the Santee pacemaker or the Wilmington pacemaker. Everyone was a pacemaker, so that's why they called this the route of the pacemakers. This is their 1960 map of all the places they flew into, and gave great service. I mean, I don't think I really have to say that, but they did. Now, for the most part, flight attendants talk about how in the 60s it was business class, and they didn't have first class until the 1980s. But it was business class. It was mostly men who needed to fly to one place or another for their job. And if anybody else was on there, they dressed appropriately too. They dressed in their best. You know, it wasn't, you didn't start on your vacation until after you got off the plane. And this is the kind of ceremony that went with flying into Chicago. And that's Mayor Daley and Mr. Davis. The 1970s, when they're subsidized by the government for the flights, because they're bringing in mail, and the idea is that if you have more, you can make revenue for yourself by bringing in passengers too. But like with Hickory, there's a lot of times they flew in, they didn't have any passengers at all, but they're flying the mail route. So when deregulation comes in 1978, this is about the time that Mr. Davis is handing off the leadership of Piedmont. He is approaching 60. And he is handing it off to Bill Howard, who was a lawyer. And at that point, they have decided that deregulation, a lot of airlines were saying that deregulation was going to be the end of it. But Piedmont looked at it very differently and said there are possibilities here. And so it's like it's talking about LA. Before that, they put in a flight to Dallas. And it filled up. So they put in a second one. And then they flew to Denver. And then when they flew to LA on that inaugural flight, and to me this is just shows you what a classy airline this was. They build it as nonstop, right? You're flying across country. But they did not have enough fuel, or so they felt, to make the full trip. So they stopped. I think it was in Denver they stopped. And the pilot made an announcement, said, I understand that this was supposed to be nonstop, but we're going to have to stop here. And Piedmont understands that you might be a bit inconvenienced by that. But if you look in the pouch in front of you, you will find a $100 bill. We're sorry for the inconvenience. And a couple of people said, they could have done that with every flight, and I would have been perfectly happy. But that shows you how much respect they had for their customers, that if they were going to do something, not be able to deliver something they promised, they compensated. Which is the exact same thing that Piedmont people got every year from Mr. Davis for a Christmas present. Was a crisp, sharp, in a little Piedmont envelope, $100 bill as a bonus. And a couple of pilots have said, that may not sound like much in today's culture. He said, but it really wasn't the money. It was the affirmation that was for every single employee there. And that made all the difference, being appreciated. And another thing about their employee base is they were unapologetically nepotistic. And they had a reason for that. They would say, it's like a couple I interviewed that both worked in maintenance, and the airline hired their son. And they said, they knew why they did it, because if the son got out of line, they went to the parents and said, your boy needs to, tighten up, he needs to, do a little better. And they had an automatic means, and the parents didn't want to be embarrassed. So the parents were always on the children to make sure that you did your best if you worked for Piedmont. And there's whole generations, several generations of people that the parents worked for Piedmont, and so did the children. It was just like an easy automatic. But the children knew that if they did, there was going to have to be this level of performance they were going to have to provide, and if they didn't want to embarrass their parents, which they did. So they go coast to coast, they go to London. This is one after the USAir deal was complete. And USAir said, we really don't want you doing that. We don't want Piedmont overshadowing us. And Bill Howard did it anyway. And they ended up going to Germany as well. But to kind of explain what happened there was that they had an investor, and it was Norfolk Southern Railway. And Norfolk Southern had floated the idea to Mr. Davis and the Piedmont folks, what if you were to create a huge transportation conglomerate that's railroad, which they've already got, which Piedmont, which they own a lot of stock in, and if you could find a shipping, boats, ships, that could carry cargo, you would have a huge transportation company. And that was kind of the plan as we went through the 80s, because once deregulation hit, and Piedmont was so incredibly successful with their flights, more so than a lot of other airlines, they became what we call the up-and-coming airline. I mean, I'm sure y'all remember the commercials that would air on ACC basketball and the like. They had McLean Stevenson as their spokesperson. There were some fun commercials. And Piedmont was on the rise. It truly was the up-and-coming airline. And so with this Norfolk Southern money that was helping to fuel that growth, they were right to pick up another airline if indeed they wanted it. And this is all, from conversation oral histories that they said that there might have been a possibility that they could have bought Delta, which would have been ripe for the taking at the time. But one other thing happens, and that is the hub system. Let me get to that here. Let me deal with this first, and I'll get back to hubs in just a minute. There's a lot of firsts that happened at Piedmont. It was a Southern airline, so it wasn't until 1966 that they hired their first African-American pilot, Warren Wheeler. He flies for several years and then starts his own kind of shuttle service to the Caribbean. 1974, Cheryl Ritchie becomes the first female pilot. In the 80s, they have an all-female crew. Captain, first officer, and the flight attendants. They build this building in Winston-Salem, and they start their first class service. So it really is an airline on the rise. But let me get to that hub thing. And this is, to some degree, this gets attributed to Bill Howard, who said, why don't we have hubs that we establish so that if, say, you're me and I'm flying in from Hickory in the morning, I can fly into Charlotte, get my flight out to wherever it is I'm going, LA or Boston, wherever, so that you have this whole stage of passengers who fly in. Charlotte's the hub. They fly out of there and so you could go anywhere in the United States, just about. And they did that in Charlotte. They did that in Baltimore at BWI. They did that in Dayton. They had this Florida shuttle service that flew all around the state of Florida. And they end up putting one in Syracuse. Now that turns out not to be the best thing. And the reason for that is it awoke the old Allegheny Air, USAir, to the fact that they had competition in their backyard. And USAir begins buying Piedmont stock and running up the price of the stock, to the point that Norfolk Southern said, man, our stock is really worth something, this Piedmont stock. And it was the decision that they made to cash out, to pay the USAir price. And that's when you got this bidding war. And at the time, which by the way, 1984 was the year that Piedmont was the airline of the year in the industry, that's when they really felt they had arrived. A model of how good an airline can be, that was another catchphrase that they used. They sponsored their first NASCAR team, I think it's Terry Labonte. And so the expansion sponsorship, the marketing, really put Piedmont on the map so that it was no longer Pete Who. It was the 9th largest airline in the United States at the time of the USAir purchase. So you have the Norfolk Southern investment in stock. You had the possible purchase of Delta, and when the merger came, it was the largest buyout that you had seen in the airline industry at the time, ever. Now, the attitude, let me back up. The official attitude was we're going to blend cool northern efficiency with warm southern hospitality. That was kind of the line that was sold, Claude and the whole group from USAir, sold to the Piedmont folks. But they all looked at it as a buyout, that you no longer did things Piedmont's way, you did things the USAir way. And they felt that they were the poor forward. Some took retirement early, some stayed, some went with other airlines. There was, and his name escapes me right now, but went down to Texas and helped build Continental Air into a formidable airline in the United States.
Gordon Bethune.
Bethune, yeah, Gordon Bethune, yes, thank you. I knew you could help me. All of that, and with their last flight in August of 1989, and once it goes away, creates a kind of mythic ethos for what this airline was. When I was working on the book in 2007-8, I was reading Charlotte Observer one day, and it was a gift from heaven. A guy wrote, and I had no connection with this guy, but I read in the paper that said, "We sure do miss Piedmont." And that was when USAir was on its first or second bankruptcy, which made all the difference in the world. So, what are we on? 35 years after the last Piedmont flight, we all still remember it. I think that demonstrates just how good an airline they were. I got some images here I'm gonna throw at you, because one of the great things about doing an airline was this marketing department was, especially once you get to the 70s, very, very good at documenting themselves for purposes of marketing and that sort of thing. And they're always taking pictures of what's going on. They were first in the ACAR system, which is a way to be able to detect other aircraft in the area. And a lot of that comes from the fact that they were flying over Cherry Point down east, and a couple of pilots talked about the fact that these military aircrafts were, getting pretty close. And so they developed their own system for collision avoidance. But Piedmont was a great company in terms of the way that they regarded their customers. And that was, I won't say it was totally unique, because like I said, I've come across another company. Southern Desk used to make church furniture, and they were incredibly particular about how that furniture looked, because it spoke of them. But it's that era of company that was so dialed in to the way that they were perceived by the public, and they took all that very personally. All right, questions, comments? Yes, sir.
There's another Piedmont Airlines, maybe it was in Maryland or somewhere up north, that started 10 years, 15, 20 years before this Piedmont, or our Piedmont. And I think they got, maybe, they still operate, but under USAir, maybe, or.
Yeah, I think you're talking about Henson.
It was originally Henson, and then they went to Piedmont.
Yeah,
It
once.
seems strange they had two Piedmont Airlines apparently at the same time.
Well, you can go online today, and there is a Piedmont Airlines, which isn't this one.
Right.
Yeah. That Henson, I think once, was it PSA? That, you had the merger USAir and PSA, and then that merger with American. And during the days of the hub, Piedmont kind of was the big deal in Charlotte, and American had their own hub in Raleigh, so they were in competition with each other. But now it's all American. What did I hear the other day? That American is like 90% of all flights in and out of Charlotte. I mean, it's huge. But yeah, they sort of took the Piedmont banner and the Speedbird and all that and dubbed that Henson as part of that to, I guess, keep the name alive. Because I had to ask for permission to use the Speedbird in on the cover of both the documentary and the book from PSA when, this is before the American merger, when I was putting the book together, because it's still an active logo.
I got the impression it was Piedmont Airlines before the local one.
I have,
Started at Henson and then went to Piedmont.
well, Piedmont bought Henson.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I don't think, Henson may have existed prior to Piedmont, but not under that name, as I understand it. But fact check us on that one. Yeah. Anything else?
What was a Speedbird?
It's
Was that called something?
it's that design. That's the bird, and it has changed over the years, but that's what they call the design. Now, they're not the only ones to have the Speedbird, but you can see that was always their logo there.
Because British Airways uses the Speedbird flag.
Yeah, it's not unique to Piedmont, but I thought it was just such a fun, interesting name that they had from pretty much the beginning. From that first year of flight, maybe not the first one, because that was just a silver plane with Piedmont Airlines right now. But they adopted that early, and then over the years they refined it. So some of these images are what people took in the office, some of it's official. It's kind of all over the place. Yes?
How big in terms of employees did it get? What was the largest number of employees?
Ooh. I think at its height, you're looking at 7,000 or 8,000. But I'd have to double check that. But, because they were buying small airlines, kind of like Henson and, several others whose, unfortunately, names escape me now, that they had, to get to the 9th largest airline, they had acquired quite a bit on their way to becoming big, because they understood if you didn't get big, you were going to get eaten up. And unfortunately, the way it played out, they eventually got eaten up. So, anything else? Yes, sir.
Do they have reunions? It sounded like a really good tight group of employees.
Oh, they do, yeah.
Do they have reunions or get-togethers or anything? Because it'd be really interesting.
I've kind of lost track. The book came out in 2008, the documentary in 2012, and my last pilots reunion was 2016. So I haven't since then. But like the Piedmont employees in Winston-Salem, they got together for lunch every week.
Oh.
And that's how much of a family they were. So your hunch is absolutely spot on in that they looked at each other as brothers and sisters. I mean, they made me an honorary captain, even though, but I tell you, one of the great things is being able to, got to fly in a DC-3 that's down at the Charlotte Aviation Museum that they have there. There's one at the North Carolina Transportation Museum in Spencer that is, it doesn't operate, but they are going to, and I've heard different stories on this, I don't know which they're going to do, either hang it from the ceiling or keep it on the ground so that you could go through it. Because it being a drag tail, kind of tilted, to the back, there's a sort of a interest in being able to walk through one.
They also have the replica of the Wright brothers plane down there, which I always figured it was a transportation museum, but it seemed like it was focused on trains. But somehow they've got a copy of the right roads.
Yeah, I think they're trying to catch up with cars and trucks and airplanes, but since they're at a rail yard, yeah, I can see why, that gives that impression. Because Spencer was the center spot between, DC and Atlanta, for, the railroad. Yes, sir?
Yeah, I remember in the seventies and maybe the eighties, Piedmont was known for its use of the prop jets, and there was a bunch of jokes for it. How unique was that among the airlines to use
Props.
jets?
I think that shows the frugality
Yeah.
in that they did not jump into jets because, for one thing, they're expensive. And for another thing, it's kind of overkill, especially for the routes they flew. And since they're small, since they're short routes, a prop would work just as good, if not better, than a jet would. Yes, ma'am.
We were returning from China when they first opened it for regular people to go in. We've been, it was embarrassing. And we've been traveling a long time coming back. We've been layover in California. We finally got to Atlanta. And they said we'd have a 12-hour layover. Well, my mother was 95 and we just thought we couldn't survive. They called in about 15 minutes, said that the flight going to Piedmont was going to Greensburg Airport. So they made a special flight just to bring us home.
Really?
They did.
Where do you hear that? Yeah. And I knew that there would be, I thank you for that story, because that just reinforces the attitude that you saw of these folks going the extra mile to do whatever it took to do the right thing. Yeah.
I don't know that he did that much for Piedmont Airlines, but, William Magruder, who came in and was there for several years, he was significant in aviation in a lot of ways. I don't know that he did anything for the company, but, he seemed a significant enough historical figure that I was inclined to connect him with Piedmont Aviation, Piedmont Airlines.
There were several. I mean, it's kind of like Gordon Bethune. These guys were big deals. Bill McGee's another one that eventually, before it got fully into the hands of USAir, he was the president of the airline. So it attracted a lot of people. Now, they didn't pay the best. They paid under what a lot of other airlines did, but people enjoyed being a part of that to the point that they were willing to accept that because it was a great working environment. And if a pilot party is allowed to go on for about an hour, that's when the good stories start to come out. And there was a guy there. Let me back up. I can show you him. That's the Speedbird. This guy, right?
Jim Brown.
Know any good Jim Brown stories?
The one where he gambled an aircraft away.
He's the one in the middle. Supposedly swore he didn't fly naked because he had his hat on. who may or may not have fell asleep. The plane was out over the Atlantic, and once he woke up, he gently nodded back in. Now, again, I don't know if all those stories are true, and that's just the ones I can tell in public. Was just a legend. He had passed away before I got a chance to interview the pilots, but he was legendary. You got any?
Probably nothing more than what you've touched on, but there. And I don't know I won't do the story justice, but apparently he was on an island overnight, and the story was that he got into a poker game, and I guess he had not been doing well, so he had the title for the aircraft there, that's in the cockpit there. He put that down and he lost it, so he's calling back home to the chief pilot office there. They somehow had to make his bet okay there, but he continued to fly afterwards. So it's
They sent him $5,000 for credit union.
Okay.
Really? Okay, okay. I'd heard that story. I didn't know how it got resolved, but I appreciate you telling me that, so that,
And he was the one that transferred some of our airplane when they were sold to the Philippines. Now, he has some stories going through Alaska to the Philippines in a 227.
really? Okay.
Very interesting.
Yeah, he was, you know, to me, he's kind of one of those cowboy pilots that he did things his own way. And I understand he was a constant thorn in the side of Jack Hadlock, who was his boss and had to try to keep him under wraps and did, you know, as good a job as he could, but Jim Brown is one of those that just would not be tamed. As a matter of fact, the only person who would not talk to me was Jim Brown's first officer, and he says, I gotta take these stories to the grave, I can't. And I tried, I really did. I said, okay, I tell you what, I won't print them, I'll do the thing that Jim, that was telling me about the Margaret Mitchell thing, that he told me to do, and he said, I'm sorry, I just can't. So, you know, who knows what wild tales that, you know, I got a couple, but wild tales that we lost because his co-pilot wouldn't tell.
I flew with him several years out of Knoxville.
Really?
Yeah.
What was that like?
Fun.
Yeah, there's all kinds of stories because y'all had layovers,
Yes.
and sometimes you'd stay in the same room
Yes.
when you come back, and so you would, I gotta codify this, you would store stuff, refreshments, and come up with inventive ways to try to not get the other crew that's coming and probably staying in that same room to not use your refreshments. Yeah.
And hide the magazines.
Okay, yeah, and there were stories about y'all taking the drawer of the dresser out and filling it with ice for the, you know, kind of the after hours sort of party they would have, you know, while they're, because it's a layover, they're waiting till the next day to fly, and you know they flew into this place, you know, got a layover, waiting till the next day to fly out, you know, put steaks on the grill and, you know, have a big time. Kind of thing.
Now, he would never mix his drinks in a little old glass. He used ice bucket and just emptied the bottle in the ice bucket.
You know, nowadays we might be a little concerned about that sort of behavior. If we as
Well, this is at least 8 hours plus before you went back in.
thank you, sir. I appreciate that disclaimer. That helps it out tremendously. Yeah. Well, thank you so. Yes, sir.
Can you explain briefly about the Speed Bird again? I didn't know if it was a logo or a type of plane or what.
Now it is a logo. If you look at this is the original Piedmont logo, and it's the airlines and Piedmont Aviation. That kind of bird-looking thing there with the wings was their image, you know, their logo thing, and that's the Speed Bird. Then over the years, it morphs into just this. So, and I don't know, being a guy who wasn't in aviation, I was just thrilled. I mean, just sort of like, wow, that's what you call that? I've seen that all my life, and I never knew what it was. So I pitched the idea to my publisher to call the history Speed Bird, and they're like, we're not going to do that. So when I got to do the documentary, I thought, I know what I'm going to call it, because, you know, I can. And so, you know, you see it pop up everywhere. And it's kind of like Marion was telling me beforehand. She's got, when they flew to Germany, they gave these little packet things. And they were like a pouch thing that you could carry, you know, overnight stuff, you know, shampoo and mouthwash and all that sort of stuff. She's got several of them at the High Point Historical Society. And at the North Carolina Museum of History wants at least one of them, but she's not giving them up because they are, you know, they're special. And I've come across stuff like that Piedmont made. I mean, they made matches, they had bookmarks, I mean, all sorts of memorabilia. They used to have little wings that they gave to kids. My wife has got a story. She flew on Piedmont when she was like 8 or 9 years old. by herself. Her mother put her on a plane to Florida to be with her sister, and there were stops. And so she got loose in the airport, and they were searching all over the place for her. And she was just kind of tooling around, looking, you know, at the magazines and that sort of stuff. And she had one of those that the stewardesses were hunting her down, trying to find her. But that's the kind of ownership. I mean, it's like you was talking about for your mother, that they took of pilots, or took of customers, in order to make sure that they got from point A to point B as safe as they could. You know, it wasn't an easy job for a lot of these flight attendants, especially women, because, you know, they had their short skirts, and, you know, it's the 60s and 70s, that sort of thing. And they would talk about how, like, 5 minutes after the plane got in the air, there was this, like, layer of smoke, you know, when everybody lit up, and they're the only ones standing up in the fuselage, so they're the ones having to breathe it. But that was part of the job, and it was, you know, being a flight attendant was glamorous enough in those days that there were a lot of women who worked very hard to do, you know, to provide that kind of service. Yes, sir. You were gonna say?
Me?
I thought I saw a hand over here, so, oh, okay, sorry.
Can I just ask a question?
Sure.
I came here because I was really interested in hearing what you had to say. Growing up as a boy in North Carolina, that's who I wanted to work for right there. But the timing never happened, and then I went to work for Continental Airlines, and you know, eventually United for many, many years. But there was a story about a Piedmont plane that landed, I don't know if it was Winston-Salem or somewhere, but it actually had some kind of anti-skid problem, and it went off the runway and almost ran into a train or something like that. Is that
Yeah,
true?
yeah. I didn't put that with the accidents because there was no loss of life there.
Yeah.
But they had one that slid off, I think it's in Charlotte, that slid off the end of the runway. And there's a picture of it you can find, I think it's online. I've seen it, where you know, the plane, the end of the runway, and it's just kind of like does sort of that.
Yeah.
I think there was a rail line there. There wasn't a train coming, but there was a rail line there. Yeah, that was.
737?
Yes, that was early, mid-80s, 83, 82, 83, 45, somewhere in there. Yeah. And you know, there were close calls. I mean, some of these pilots talk about just, you know, how close they could get, but they were trained so well and so regularly, they had to be able to keep the kind of safety record they had. Going once, going twice. Well, thank you so much for sitting through, listening sometimes UNC airs the documentary. It's been on. I put it for the DVD in like 3 half-hour segments, but the version that runs on UNC is kind of a conglomeration. There's a few things cut out, but you know, you can see basically what it was. Yes,
It's
sir.
available for streaming?
I'm not that technically advanced. It can be, but I haven't really done anything to make that happen. So there's copies down at the Transportation Museum, but yeah, I'm still stuck in the DVD here. So my apologies for being a dinosaur. Yeah. Well, have some Piedmont punch.
Yeah, I wanted to take a minute, I wanted to thank everybody